One number has been hiding in plain sight for years, and if you invested in XRP early, this single overlooked detail might completely change how you see your entire investment. It's something almost no early holder ever thinks about, yet it quietly determines who wins, who gives up, and who ends up watching XRP make its biggest moves from the sidelines. Today, you're going to discover the one thing nearly every early XRP investor never noticed. You will learn how early positions can become psychological traps, how hidden cycles quietly shape XRP's long-term behavior, and why the biggest dangers for early holders are almost never technical. They're emotional, structural, and deeply human. And by the end of this video, you might look at your XRP bag with completely different eyes. But let me start with a question only early investors can answer. If you bought XRP years ago, do you actually understand what you're holding? Or did you simply get used to waiting? Because waiting and understanding are not the same thing. One creates conviction, the other creates fatigue. Let's begin with the illusion almost every early XRP investor unknowingly falls into. When you buy early, you feel like you've secured a permanent advantage. You hold the asset before the masses. You hold a position that looks genius when the price pumps, and you convince yourself that time is on your side. But here's the hidden twist. Early entry comes with a psychological weight that late entrants don't carry. Because when you enter at the beginning, every delay feels personal. Every sideways stretch feels like betrayal. And every crashed expectation feels heavier than it should. That emotional tax quietly accumulates over the years until the advantage of being early becomes a silent emotional burden. Early doesn't always mean easy, and that's the first thing most early holders never noticed. Across XRP's long history, there is a recurring pattern almost no one talks about, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. XRP doesn't rise in slow arcs like traditional assets. It moves in deep, silent compression phases, followed by violent expansions, years of quiet, months of disbelief, then days of explosive upside that erase years of stagnation in a single breath. Early investors usually experience the compression, but not the expansion, because they emotionally detach right before the ignition. That's the hidden cycle at play: long boredom, sudden awakening. This pattern has repeated since 2013. It's the heartbeat of XRP. And yet, most early holders never connect their own frustration to the asset's natural rhythm. They assume something is wrong. In reality, their expectations were. What's the real reason early XRP holders stay stuck? It isn't the market. It isn't the price. It's the invisible emotional contract they signed without realizing it. When you invest early, you begin with imagination instead of evidence. You picture what it could become. But over time, imagination turns into doubt, and doubt turns into exhaustion. Meanwhile, the people who buy later walk in with clarity instead of hope. They see an ecosystem more mature, more structured, more real. Ironically, the later investor often understands the asset better than the early one. The one thing early holders never noticed is that entering early doesn't guarantee understanding. Sometimes it prevents it. Another overlooked dimension is the utility layer itself. Many early XRP holders bought for the narrative, not the mechanics. They saw the potential for cross-border payments, the excitement around banks, the promise of speed. But they didn't internalize the deeper architecture of the XRP ledger. They didn't notice how the network evolved quietly in the background, real-world stablecoins being built, AMMs being refined, liquidity corridors opening, tokenization experiments emerging. While retail fixated on price, the infrastructure grew underneath them. XRP's progression is infrastructural, not emotional. Early holders often miss this because they're too focused on chart fatigue to notice protocol evolution. Utility grows silently. Great systems rarely announce their progress. Let's talk about supply, because here lies one of the greatest blind spots of all. Early holders often think in terms of total supply, but not liquid supply. Those two things are radically different. Yes, XRP has a large supply on paper, but only a small percentage of it is in real circulation. The rest sits in escrow, in institutional custody, in long-term wallets, or in places that simply don't react to market noise. Liquidity and supply are not the same thing. XRP appears abundant, but behaves scarce. That duality confuses early holders because they assume supply works like a meme coin: minted, dumped, consumed. But in XRP's world, supply is a system, a design, a controlled valve. And that's something most early holders simply never noticed. There's another psychological layer worth exploring: why waiting feels like losing. Early holders often measure their investment in years instead of structure. Every year without a breakout feels like a punishment. Every delay feels like stagnation. But that emotional timeline is an illusion. XRP doesn't operate on the timeline of individual investors. It operates on the timeline of global finance, regulation, institutional adoption, payments infrastructure, and macro cycles. Those forces don't move because a chart is boring. They move because entire industries shift, which takes time, a lot of it. Most early holders confuse slow price movement with lack of progress, and that misalignment fuels doubt. But time isn't the real metric. Structure is. Here's something even deeper: the invisible progress curve. XRP's evolution has never been linear. It's been step-based. Long stretches of groundwork interrupted by sudden leaps, like legal clarity, regulatory shifts, government partnerships, payment corridors opening, and large-scale institutional narratives forming. The visible progress appears tiny until it suddenly isn't. This is the exact opposite of hype coins, where everything looks big at first and collapses later. With XRP, everything looks quiet until it isn't. That's the invisible curve that early holders almost always miss because they're looking for short-term validation instead of long-term transformation. Now let's talk about the one metric almost nobody tracks, but it's arguably one of the most important: exchange liquidity velocity. Not the amount of XRP on exchanges, but the speed at which it moves. When the velocity slows, it indicates hoarding, accumulation, or structural constraint. When velocity drops to extreme lows, it means traders aren't selling and whales aren't rotating. That's when pressure silently builds. This metric predicted several historic XRP moves, but early investors rarely track it because they're glued to the price chart. Price lags, liquidity reveals. And this is something early holders almost universally overlook. Let's pause and ask a deeper question. If you invested in XRP early, did you do it because you understood the asset or because you understood the potential? There's a difference. Potential is easy to believe in. Mechanics require study. Most early holders bought the dream, not the blueprint. And as years passed, the dream faded because they never connected it to the underlying architecture. Meanwhile, institutions who arrived later began studying the blueprint itself. This is one of the great ironies in the XRP story. Late institutional entrants often understand more about XRP's utility than early retail believers. Understanding always beats timing, always. There's a paradox at the center of every early investment. The more time passes, the more emotional the position becomes. Early holders don't just track price, they track identity. They track the feeling of being right or wrong. They track validation. And that creates mental traps. You're not just holding XRP, you're holding years of expectation. When price doesn't move, the expectation feels heavy. And when price finally does move, some early holders sabotage themselves because they no longer trust the asset they've been waiting on. They sell too soon or not at all. The paradox is simple. Early investors often exit early or too late because they never noticed how much emotion took control. Another phenomenon most early investors never think about is the price memory effect. When someone buys XRP at 20 cents, 30 cents, or 50 cents, their brain locks in those numbers. When the asset rises, they feel rich. When it falls, they feel robbed. But institutions don't feel any of that. They have no emotional attachment to past prices. They see value purely in terms of future utility and liquidity structure. That's why institutional investors often outperform early retail. They don't drag old price memories with them. They see the asset in the present, while early holders often see it through the lens of the past. That imbalance creates missed opportunities. Now here's a twist. Institutions actually look at XRP differently from early holders. Retail focuses on price. Institutions focus on flow. Retail looks for a bull run. Institutions look for liquidity pathways. Retail fears delays. Institutions expect them. Most early holders never notice that institutions don't need the perfect chart. They need the perfect system. And XRP's system is far more robust today than it was when early holders first bought in. Ironically, early holders sometimes see the least because they stopped studying once they entered the position. What early investors often overlook about liquidity is that XRP's float is structurally thin. Many coins simply aren't available. They sit in long-term wallets, inactive since early years. They sit in corporate custody. They sit in escrow. They sit in deep storage. The available supply is much, much smaller than the total supply. When institutions enter, they don't need to buy the entire supply. They just need to disturb the thin float. And when that happens, price doesn't climb. It gaps. Most early holders never realize that XRP doesn't pump smoothly. It reprices violently. Time works differently for institutions. 3 years to a retail investor feels like an eternity. But to an institutional allocator, 3 years is a normal rotation cycle. Banks think in decades. Payment networks think in generations. Regulators think in multi-year frameworks. Early holders often assume the world should move on crypto time, but XRP is a bridge asset for traditional finance, and traditional finance does not rush. Most early holders never noticed that their timeline wasn't aligned with the sector XRP was built for. Let's zoom out to the broader trend already in motion. Tokenization is accelerating, settlement rails are evolving, stablecoins are expanding, treasury instruments are being digitized, cross-border payment systems are being rebuilt in real time. XRP's relevance isn't tied to charts, it's tied to infrastructure. That infrastructure is maturing quietly, consistently, and globally. But early holders often miss this because they are fixated on the when, not the why. The why is transforming. The when catches up suddenly. There's also a powerful truth early investors rarely understand. You can be early twice. Being early at the beginning doesn't mean you're early during the adoption phase. These are different cycles. A person who buys XRP in 2025 after major banks adopt tokenized settlement could still be early for the regulatory and sovereign phase. Early is not a single event. It's a repeating window for those who understand evolution instead of clinging to nostalgia. Many early holders never notice that you can be late early and still win massively. Here comes the great miscalculation. Early investors often assume that holding the longest brings the highest reward. But rewards don't track time. They track alignment. Alignment with adoption, alignment with liquidity, alignment with structural shifts. A person who held XRP for 6 years but stopped studying may be less prepared than someone who studied for 6 months. The asset doesn't reward duration, it rewards awareness. That's the key miscalculation. Most early holders never noticed it. Another fascinating psychological phenomenon is the price that changes minds. Every early holder has one. A number that transforms doubt into belief. A number that flips fear into confidence. Early holders rarely admit it, but they all have a price that breaks their emotional deadlock. And ironically, when XRP reaches that number, some early holders feel less certain, not more, because the price finally proves what they stopped believing years ago. Confidence returns too late. Emotion clouds logic. This cycle repeats endlessly. And now we return to the heart of the video, the one thing early XRP investors never noticed. You didn't invest early in a price, you invested early in a timeline, a system, a transformation. XRP was never designed to move fast. It was designed to move efficiently. It was never meant to follow hype. It was built to follow adoption. You invested early in a utility curve that takes years to unfold. And the reason many early investors feel lost is because they never realized what they were actually early to. You weren't early to a pump. You were early to an infrastructure shift. That's the one thing early holders rarely see until they zoom out far enough to notice. So what does all of this mean for where XRP stands today? It means that most early holders judge their investment by volatility instead of evolution. They followed charts instead of liquidity. They followed hype instead of infrastructure. And they never noticed the quiet transitions that matter far more than any bullish candle ever could. If you invested early, your advantage wasn't price. It was time to understand the blueprint. The question now is simple. Will you? Not professional advice. Consult a qualified expert as needed.